Shalom Lekulam. Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem. Welcome to everyone. We have an audience from around the world, from here in Israel, where I am, from North America and Europe and South Africa, and I'm sure a host of other places as well. I think we have some newcomers to this regular Wednesday series with us. We had our very successful Begin Symposium, our first symposium on Sunday, and I know that a few of the attendees from there are joining us here on a Wednesday for the first time. So welcome to you. I hope you'll join us for future weeks. So just a little bit of housekeeping. Every Wednesday we have these events in English at 8:30 Israel time. That's 1:30 US Eastern time. And we have a range of speakers talking about Israeli politics and the wider Middle East, Israeli history, Zionism, Menachem Begin, of course, and basically a lot of the issues that we focus on here at the Begin Center, and that we think that people who are interested in the Begin Center will be interested in as well. I'm going to introduce our speaker for today momentarily. Let me just say that I'll just explain the format for the newcomers. After I've spoken to our speaker for half an hour or so, I will open the floor to questions, which you can pose by writing in the chat box, the chat facility at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please write away, and I will select some of those questions to put to our speaker. Now, what are we going to talk about today? Well, events move very quickly here, and obviously right now in Israel, the main topic is what's going on in Israeli politics, and we are actually going to discuss that next week. But just a couple of weeks ago, all the talk was of the conflict going on between Israel and Hamas, the latest round of this seemingly never-ending series of rocket fire from Hamas and response from Israel. This time we had the added spice, if you like, of some domestic problems within Israel, including attacks on Jews by Arabs and attacks on Arabs by Jews, the Sheikh Jarrah controversy, things going on Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount as well. So it was all happening, and it was all very focused on what was going on here in Israel. Those of you living outside of Israel will no doubt have been also very focused on the terrible incidents of anti-Semitism that were very much in the news and connected in a certain way to what was happening here. But what I wanted to do, because I know that we've all in our different ways been sort of immersed in all of that for the past few weeks, I wanted to look at the situation through a wider lens, and I was helped along in that mission by an article that I read in the National Interest, the American political journal, the National Interest, entitled "The Real Impact of the War Between Hamas and Israel," which looks at the war, the recent conflict, the recent round of conflict, and its potential consequences through a regional lens, through a Middle East lens. And so I'm very happy to have with us today the author of that piece, Dr. Sarah Feuer, who is a research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, which is one of Israel's most prestigious think tanks. She's also an associate fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Her 2018 book, published by Cambridge University Press, examined religion-state dynamics in the Arab world with a focus on North Africa. More recently, her writings have explored cross-regional trends across the Middle East and their implications on Israeli national security. So welcome, Sarah. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So it's a fascinating piece, a fascinating article. And what I wanted to do to start with is look at this a point that you raised, which I think is it's a great starting point for our conversation and a really interesting way to branch out from Israel to the wider Middle East context. And you talk about 4 developments in recent years in the Middle East, which you say have directly impacted the conflict. One is the declining power of Sunni political Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood, etc. Second is the ascendance of anti-Islamist Sunni states, including those which have sought to draw closer to Israel, most notably, of course, in the Abraham Accords. The third is the diminishing regional salience of the Palestinian issue, and I think that's something that's very relevant for us and interesting. And finally, a less assertive Iranian camp as a result of sanctions from the Trump administration and America and Israeli actions and other things. So can I start by asking you about those 4 points and in what way they were critical to the way the conflict unfolded?
Sure. So thanks again for having me, and thanks to the Begin Center for putting on these events. So yeah, maybe I'll just try to unpack a little bit each of these broader regional developments. I should say though that none of this should distract or none of this is meant to take away from, of course, the local grievances and complexities of the relationship between Israel and the Palestinian Authority and Hamas in Gaza. Of course, all of that played a key role, but part of the point of the piece is to argue that there is a broader regional context here, and that sometimes we tend to lose sight of some of these bigger developments. So the four that I wanted to highlight, the first has to do with this declining clout, I would say, maybe of the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamist movements around the region that are either derived from the Brotherhood or sympathetic with the Brotherhood. This is something that we saw really since 2013, when the presidency of Mohamed Morsi in Egypt was essentially overturned. He had represented the Muslim Brotherhood, and after that, you saw a kind of cascade throughout the region of movements that had been either Brotherhood affiliates or sympathizers. There was a big backlash against these movements. And so, part of what I think we saw in Hamas's effort to present itself as its emphasis on Jerusalem, on protecting Muslims, this was, on the face of it, a little bit puzzling from the local standpoint, because of course Hamas isn't really involved in anything in Jerusalem. Hamas doesn't have any formal representation there. It might have some support in the Palestinian community, but even that is debatable. And so, why would they be harping on Jerusalem so much? Well, it sort of makes more sense if you see it as an attempt, which I think it partly was, to inject a bit of momentum or energy into what had otherwise been a movement and a strain of thought that had really been on the decline in the region for several years. Now, in parallel to this decline, and I think partly, maybe even partially a cause of that decline, was this ascendance of that second group that you mentioned. These, what in Israel we typically refer to as the Sunni Pragmatic states. So these are countries like Egypt, Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Morocco. And so you'll notice that some of these include states that recently signed normalization agreements with Israel. That camp, I think, had been kind of on the up and up. And the agreements that we signed with some of these states last year really gave it the bloc a kind of a dose of added, I would say, consolidation, maybe some strength. There was a perception that these states were going to start setting the kind of regional agenda. And what we saw during the operation in Gaza was very interesting. You know, the reaction of these states. First of all, there was a clear effort on the part of Hamas and Hamas's sympathizers to paint some of this as an attempt to thwart the normalization and an attempt to push back against that trend of sort of coming together in a sense of these Sunni states with Israel. But you also saw, you know, in the reaction of countries throughout the region, there was a very stark difference between how countries such as Qatar and Turkey, which had been broadly sympathetic with that first camp that I noted, the Muslim Brotherhood, and by extension, they had been sympathetic with Hamas. You know, their response to Israeli military action in the Gaza Strip was much. The condemnation was much fiercer. It was laden with, you know, anti-Semitism. I mean, if you compare that to the reactions of the states in this pragmatic camp, the UAE, the Saudis, and others, they were upset about Jerusalem. But Jerusalem, remember, has a religious significance for Muslims around the world. They were upset about that. But once the conflict shifted to Gaza, you really didn't hear much. And where you did, it was pretty even-handed. They were as critical of Hamas as they were concerned about about civilians being unintentionally hurt or killed in Gaza. The third thing that you mentioned has to do with the Palestinian issue regionally. And here I think we need to be a little bit careful, because it's not that people around the region have stopped caring about Palestinians or the Palestinian cause. I don't think we have any evidence of that. Certainly survey data, to the extent that it's reliable, does not support that. What we have seen, though, in the last decade is that the Palestinian issue, partly because most of these countries are busy dealing with a whole host of other problems, mostly economic, some social, some religious in a way, that the Palestinian issue isn't able anymore to really get people out into the streets like it used to. And also, I think a number of governments, a number of regimes have decided that they're not going to wait anymore for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict to be solved in order to push through with some of their own national interests. And if those interests can be served by signing a normalization agreement with Israel, then so be it. And I think in what Hamas was trying to do here was partly targeting the Palestinian Authority, partly trying to establish itself as now really the dominant player in the Palestinian national movement, and to remind the region, you know, there is this thing called the Palestinian cause, and don't forget about us. That only makes sense if you're, you know, in the context of what has otherwise been a sort of a movement with diminishing regional significance, I think. And the last thing you mentioned was Iran. And, you know, Iran in the last decade, and it's, this kind of camp that we generally refer to, whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon, Bashar al-Assad in Syria, the Houthis in Yemen to some extent. That camp, I think, had been doing rather well for much of the last decade. But actually in the year plus leading up to this latest eruption, that Iran had been a little bit in a wait and see mode, a little bit on its back heels. It was dealing with initially it had been dealing with COVID. It was dealing with the sanctions of the Trump administration. It had these two hits on the leadership of the IRGC. And so the fact that during this war, you know, with the exception of a few rockets that came out from Lebanon, there was an Iranian drone that came from Syrian territory. But this was all sort of, I think, more in line with a kind of Iranian camp that is I think in the article I referred to it as almost sort of kind of cheering on from the bleachers, but they were not really in a position to be getting much more overtly involved. So those are just some examples of how I think that this broader regional, what has really been a struggle between various camps over influence, over setting the regional agenda, really the contours of the Middle East, I think really play themselves out in local developments that we see, even ones like the war.
Right. I think it's a really useful way of thinking about the Middle East and the different camps within it as well. And I'd ask everyone joining us, watching, to think of questions that you want to pose to Sarah about any of those specific camps as well. One of the things that struck me was that I was wondering to myself, how new is this attitude of the Sunni anti-Islamist states, the Sunni authoritarian pragmatic states, in terms of its anti-Iranian and anti-brotherhood position, and a sort of de facto and now more than de facto sympathy or affinity with Israel's agenda. And I was thinking, even if you go back, even, what is it now, like 15 years to the Second Lebanon War. I remember that initially, at least, before it really started to heat up, there was this notable lack of condemnation of Israel from the Saudis and the Gulf states, and a condemnation instead of Hezbollah for drawing Lebanon into a war, because they saw Hezbollah as the Iranian proxy that it is, and so they were much more concerned about Iran than Israel. And the one difference between then and now that not the one difference, but one of the differences that I can see between then and now is that then, although they were very critical of Hamas as a being funded by Iran, they were clearly very, very vocally supportive of the Palestinian Authority and of Mahmoud Abbas, and before him Arafat. And now it does seem like there's this sort of distancing or a lack of a really overt vocal support for the Palestinian Authority. And I wonder whether how much of that is what you were talking about they have other things on their plate, essentially, and how much of it is also just that for a whole variety of reasons, Abbas and the Palestinian Authority have become less relevant and have become less less seen as less of a player in the Middle East.
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right in what you've highlighted, I think is correct. When you look at 2006, just the example you cited, I mean, these states that I sort of classed in this Sunni pragmatic camp, I think for a long time, the really the number one threat from their standpoint, and therefore the number one kind of enemy in a sense, was Iran. I think they were principally concerned about Iran, and so it made sense in 2006, if Hezbollah is stirring things up, these guys don't like seeing that any more than we do. I think one thing that has shifted, and this really was something that came out of the Arab uprisings a decade ago, and really that period between 2011, 2012, is that the secondary threat from their standpoint of the Muslim Brotherhood and of political Islam. I mean, most of these authoritarian regimes in the Arab world have tolerated some presence of Islamist movements on their territory. There was always, I mean, certainly in Egypt, where the Brotherhood originated, there was always a space kind of left for the Brotherhood to operate, mostly in Egyptian society. And in other countries, it was similar. There was a feeling that while they didn't want these groups to become politically salient and politically active, they gave them room to operate because they reasoned that it would probably help them maintain a kind of legitimacy if they could show their populations, okay, but we're supporting Islamic movements, we're supporting religious observance, and so on and so forth. The big shift happened in 2011 when all of a sudden, well, they didn't start any of these uprisings. These brotherhood movements, which, as I said, had room to really operate in society, and so they had a base of support. All of a sudden, they became political actors, and from the standpoint of regimes, that placed them on a level of threat, I think, in some cases, even which was perceived as even greater than Iran. So, what we've seen in the last 8-9 years is that pragmatic camp, and this is what I think is slightly new from what you were, your original question of what's new here. I think the force with which these states have come to view political Islam as a threat really was enhanced after coming out of the Arab uprisings. Just a quick note about the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas. So, you're very astute to notice that you don't hear a lot of these guys coming to Abu Mazen's defense. They don't even really mention the Palestinian Authority much. They will talk about the Palestinians, but they have not. They're not really lending much rhetorical support to Abbas and his guys. And I think it's for a few reasons. One is that the PA never really did a very good job of positioning itself regionally. I mean, there's a sort of irony here that the Palestinian cause or the movement really always garnered its strength from the region, in the sense that it knew that it was this kind of, it had this galvanizing, mobilizing ability throughout the region. But once the PA kind of failed to establish itself within one of these regional camps, for example, in contrast to, say, Hamas, which was very clearly aligned with a regional movement, a regional bloc of these Muslim Brotherhood movements and state sympathizers. The PA doesn't have the equivalent of that. And so it doesn't have allies in the region now that can really sort of rally to its defense. And the other reason is that, quite frankly, most of these regimes find the PA too corrupt at this point. And so there is a sense, if you talk to people in Abu Dhabi, for example, I mean, they will, I think there is a sense that there's some frustration with the Palestinian Authority for not managing, and there's plenty of frustration and blame that's dealt to Israel also when it comes to the situation for the Palestinians, but there's just a kind of feeling of being fed up with the PA, and so it plays out in instances like this mini war that we had, where nobody really came to the PA's defense.
Right. That's really interesting, and I think one of the big surprises of the war was Egypt's unexpected influence, and I think it played a key role in brokering the ceasefire, and I wonder if, given Egypt's historically significant role in the Arab world, are we seeing Egypt sort of return to a prominent role in the Middle East, and specifically in terms of the Israel and the Palestinians, and maybe specifically with regard to Gaza?
Yeah, so this is a big question that everybody's sort of wrestling with now. I mean, first of all, we should acknowledge that Egypt has, in previous rounds, Protective Edge in 2014 and others, the Egyptians have played a role in brokering ceasefires in the past, and so it's not a first in that sense. What I think is new, and what is leading people to sort of wonder whether this is signaling a desire in Cairo to take on a larger role in Gaza and perhaps even regionally, is that they are making more noises about really wanting to invest in Gaza. In other words, put sort of their own money and potentially even sort of manage things a bit more within the Gaza Strip. And it's a little bit hard to know kind of what their end game here really is. I mean, I tend to think that a lot of this had actually less to do with Egypt's regional ambitions and more to do with, frankly, getting on Washington's good side. And so if Sisi can demonstrate to the Biden administration that he wants to play a constructive role in bringing about a ceasefire and then ensuring that these sort of successive waves of eruption don't continue, then I think it buys him a lot of goodwill in Washington, where the regime in Egypt has not really, they have an image problem. Let's put it that way. But whether this is about Egypt wanting to assert a greater regional role, there may be some of that in this. I mean, they certainly do seem to want to edge out a bit more the Qataris and the Turks and some of their other rivals that have lately become more involved in Gaza. And, from Israel's standpoint, I think, all else being equal, we would probably be better off seeing a greater role for Egypt relative to, let's say, Qatar or Turkey. But there's a little bit of an asterisk there also, because I think that there is a recognition. A lot of the materials that we're able to get into Gaza these last several years, which Hamas then used to make its rockets and so on and build its tunnels. This smuggling was going on under Egyptian eyes, and the Egyptians were the ones who were monitoring some of these border crossings. And so I think that there will have to be some sort of quiet but frank discussions between Israel and Egypt if really Egypt is going to get more involved, just to ensure that this kind of thing isn't allowed to continue.
That's very interesting. Okay, so a bunch of questions have already come through, so I'm gonna switch to the questions from the audience and see where we go with those. So we have a question here from Jeffrey, who notes that the Arab Sunni states are better able to see the Palestinian issue in proportion relative to much of Europe, for example. And he said, it seems that Israel's existence has become more accepted in the Middle East at the same time as it's losing legitimacy in the wider world, in the West particularly, I think he means. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there was a interesting piece that an Emirati, a guy who serves on the, he's an Emirati official essentially on their defense and security, their main defense and security body within they do have a legislative body. It's of course not, the UAE is not a democracy, it's far from it, but he is a high-ranking, we can think of him as a high-ranking security official in the UAE, and he just had this piece that he wrote, I think, in Newsweek, and he pointed out that it was sort of telling that the Western narratives about this latest war between Israel and Hamas did seem to put all the blame on Israel, but really we see a lot more of the blame falling on Hamas and by extension Iran. So if I would encourage you all to go look for this Newsweek piece. But I think it gets to this this sort of broader point that was raised in the question. There is, if we look at the normalization agreements as a kind of gradual acceptance, an acknowledgement of Israel's presence in the region, I think that's only a good thing. I think we did see in this latest round, I was pretty struck by the press coverage of this confrontation between Israel and Hamas in the United States. Actually, the Europeans this time around came out sort of relatively less egregious, frankly.
Yeah.
We even had, I think Israel had visits of a few European heads of state, and it was, so there, I must admit, I myself am sort of still trying to understand whether this is indicative of a really deeper shift underway, if what we're seeing is, or if this was just kind of a weird sort of one-off almost. I mean,
yeah, I definitely think there was a quite a gap between the response of European of sections of the European population and the chattering classes, if you like, in Europe, and the governments. That I definitely think that seemed to me to be evident. Okay, there's a question here from Isabel she asked about whether the relationship between the United States and Iran, how that relationship plays into this equation. And maybe I'll just build on that by asking if the development in the negotiations on the JCPOA how that will impact things.
Yeah, so this is a great question. I think that what we have seen in the last, I would say, maybe in the last year, I think, since countries in the region, particularly these Sunni pragmatic states, since they began essentially planning for the possibility that there would be a change in administration in Washington, and that change would also bring with it a return to negotiations toward a nuclear agreement with Iran. I think you have seen, look, you even have some people arguing, I don't really fully ascribe to this, but there is an argument that part of what motivated some of these states to even sign on to the normalization agreements was an effort to get certain things out of the Trump administration in time before there would be a change in government in the United States. In part because there was an assumption that the change to a democratic administration would potentially embolden Iran in some way. And so, you had the UAE, for example, wanting to get its hands on the F-35s. And so some sense of planning ahead. And that may very well have had to do with the US-Iran relationship. I think more recently, what we've seen is, as these negotiations have gone on, I think that states in the region are essentially kind of hedging. They're basically saying, on the one hand, they're keeping up the tough, certainly the rhetoric against Iran. They see the normalization agreements with Israel as, I think, an important element of a broader strategic policy to try and counter Iran in the region, with the knowledge that the US may very well be diminishing its footprint in the region. And so on the one hand, this kind of consistent effort to push back against Iran. And on the other hand, I do think we've seen a bit more of an effort on the part of some of these states to even engage with Iran, because if now Iran is going to, if there is an agreement, and I should say it's still a big if. We're not seeing it yet. But if there is an agreement that's reached, and Iran comes out of that agreement in a better position, states like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, these guys are right next door. So they don't want to find themselves in a situation where they have just antagonized their neighbor, and now their neighbor is suddenly not, is suddenly sort of welcomed back into the fold in some way. And so they're hedging. And you have seen more contacts between the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others with Iran lately. And it's a question for Israel, frankly, if that's, what I don't see this hedging as really fundamentally undermining the normalization agreements, but it is something to watch out for.
Okay. So if we can move from Iran to Turkey. And I know you mentioned Turkey in terms of its much stronger and even anti-Semitic response to the conflict, with its now basically Muslim Brotherhood government of Erdogan. And we have a question from Jeff Daub who asks if you can speak to Erdogan's moves to extend his sphere of influence with Hamas and in Jerusalem, and is there any relationship between the two?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that Erdogan he's quite the case. I mean, he himself never, he never declared that he was sort of taking on the leadership of this kind of brotherhood camp. Certainly not. I mean, it sort of fell to him by default because he was sort of the only one left standing who, after Morsi was toppled and the Egyptian regime under Sisi really, turned very anti-Islamist and therefore anti-Erdogan. And I think Erdogan has felt, if anything, has felt a bit sort of isolated and encircled these last few years. So he didn't really sign up for it, but when it sort of fell to him, he has embraced this kind of position as advocating on behalf of Muslims everywhere, promoting political Islam, supporting brotherhood movements, and part of that policy has translated into a growing presence for Turks in Jerusalem. There has been an encouragement of Turks to buy up property in Jerusalem, to develop a greater religious presence. He was encouraging a lot of Turks to travel to Jerusalem on essentially the equivalent of sort of religious pilgrimage. And the support for Hamas is very much in keeping with, we have to remember that in 2013, when the Brotherhood fell in Egypt, a lot of their guys fled to Turkey. And a lot of the sort of pro-Brotherhood media outlets that have remained in the region are based in Turkey. And there are a number of Hamas guys who are living it up in Turkey. So that, and we saw this in the reaction, as I noted earlier, his reactions during the war, it was very much in keeping with this, this kind of more broader regional alignment. The question is kind of what he's going to do with it now. And, it's, he had really tried to stake out a broader regional sort of assertiveness in recent years. So you saw, for example, the Turks really trying to go almost everywhere. They have a military presence now in Qatar. They've been in Libya for several years now, and they don't really show any signs of wanting to leave. So we'll have to see. There's a little known fact that I myself just learned the other day. I was in a conversation with our the fellow at the Institute who works on Turkey, and turns out that the Turks have a security agreement, essentially a sort of security treaty with the Palestinian Authority. And it's one of these things that, essentially says if the PA needs assistance when it comes to, for example, countering smuggling or, drug offenses, that the Turks will lend security assistance. Now, on the face of it, we could sort of laugh at it and say, well, yeah, whatever. But these are the kinds of agreements that the Turks have sort of gone around using in the region to then insert themselves much more forcefully militarily. They did it in Libya, and they've done it elsewhere. So it's a little bit, I don't expect a Turkish invasion in Jerusalem tomorrow, but I just sort of flag it as a kind of an interesting development. And Erdogan is increasingly unpredictable himself.
Yeah, he's definitely, I think, one to watch. Turkey's one to watch for
Also,
developments.
the country is dealing with a very serious economic downturn right now. And, this is also partly why I think the Hamas war gave them a little bit of a distraction, and they could deflect some of the attention that was on COVID and on the lira. The Turkish lira is in sort of free fall. So this was an out for him, at least a temporary one.
Interesting. Okay, so sticking with the Sunni Islamists for now. I said at the beginning that because we're talking about this, we're moving away from the big headline news in Israel, which is all the Israeli politics stuff. But we actually have a question here, which is kind of interesting. I wonder what your take on it is, from Robin, who asks that while the pragmatic Sunni states view the politicization of Islamists negatively, I assume she means the political power of Islamists, what about the Islamist party that may well be in the next Israeli coalition? Is Mansour Abbas and his Ram party being talked about at all?
Yeah, that's whoever asked the question, it's very perceptive. So there is some discomfort in places like the UAE. There is a bit of discomfort with seeing a party like Ram enter the government, because from their standpoint, this is a party that has roots vaguely in the Muslim Brotherhood. And so, there's not, the level of the discomfort, I think, is coming through in private conversations. We're not seeing anything public yet to the effect that, they would condemn it or anything like that. But I think they're in a difficult spot, of course, these Sunni states, because their populations, in the way that you noted about the gap between European populations and their governments, there is also a gap to some extent in these countries. I mean, the leadership was very determined to go through with the normalization, and they seem very determined to continue. I mean, these agreements have survived the latest escalation, but there are segments of these populations that are deeply uncomfortable with it. And so, they're in a tricky spot. So on the one hand, I think it's in their interest to demonstrate support for a new Israeli government. If the new Israeli government will potentially bring in, we really don't know that, by the way. I mean, it's not at all clear that a new Israeli government in its current form, anyway, if it takes office, is going to really shift policy when it comes to the Palestinians. But there certainly is a hope on the part of these states that there will be a shift. But on the other hand, there's this kind of caveat that they're not crazy about Ram.
Interesting.
It's wild. It really is like the new Middle East. But
yeah, really. Yeah. The events of the last few days. So there's been a few questions, and this is somewhat off topic from the main thrust of your article, but there's a few questions on a similar theme. So I do want to put it to you, which is basically about the conflict itself between Israel and Hamas, and the ongoing nature of it, the repeated nature of it. Eliyahu says that the ceasefire started before Israel had finished its military operation or had achieved all of its military goals. Ora asks if you, Sarah, have any recommendations as to how Israel can permanently stop these attacks by Hamas without necessitating the carpet bombing of Gaza. It seems there's a pattern of barrages of rockets, then an Israeli response. Is there some kind of strategy for ending what she calls this dysfunctional and dangerous pattern? And there was an earlier question from someone about whether Hamas won. Whether I'm not sure whether the question is whether you think Hamas has won, or whether the wider Middle Eastern states think Hamas won. But can you speak to that somewhat? Just give us your 2 pennies worth on that.
Yeah, this is one of these things where I'm tempted to say, well, I'm really sorry, but we're out of time.
Sorry, we're not.
So the question about, maybe I'll answer the question about, I'll try to answer the question about whether Hamas won first, and then I'll get back to the
sure.
tougher one about what to do about all of this. So did Hamas win? I tend to be of the view that the notion of victory, we have to think of this in sort of time intervals. Okay, so certainly, if the goal of Hamas was to make a real, how would I put it, to essentially diminish or knock down the Palestinian Authority and establish itself as a more perhaps credible, a more serious representative of the Palestinian cause, then I think at the level of narrative, certainly, Hamas, achieved something here. The PA was already very weakened going into this, and it certainly did not come out of this in very good shape. So in that sense, in the short term, I would say we can give that one to Hamas. But, the larger sort of longer term, what does Hamas really want? I think I frankly, I tend to believe people when they say they want to kill me, but I think Hamas is pretty clear about what its ultimate goal is. And there, I don't think it can claim any real victory here. I mean, the damage that was done to its essentially what counts for its military infrastructure was pretty severe. I sometimes think of the example of 2006 in the Second Lebanon War. Following that war, I think Israelis had a lot of difficulty being able to point to something resembling a victory. And yet, it's 15 years later now, and Hezbollah has remained deterred. And so if you had asked people a month after the Lebanon war was over, I think you would have gotten very different answers than how we view things today. So that's for the question about whether Hamas won. I also, frankly, am not sure that, yes, it enjoys the support of the Qataris and the Turks, and in some ways, public opinion in some quarters of the Arab world, definitely. But I don't think it had a kind of knockout punch, even on the regional level. These countries that normalized with Israel, nobody recalled an ambassador. I mean, really nothing. Things were slowed down in terms of the momentum of sort of engagement on the sort of people to people and business to business. But I think this is full steam ahead. So I would be wary of people who are jumping to claim that Hamas won. I'm not so sure that Israel won definitively either, though. And this gets to the first question, I think, about what Israel can do to try and prevent these repeated rounds of. So I think that there are a few things that we definitely ought to try to do, short of. There is, I think, a consensus that, what would it take to actually definitively stop rockets? It would essentially take a pretty major ground invasion and probably a determination to reoccupy Gaza. So it's not a mystery what it would require, I think. The problem, of course, is that the cost is, for right now, I think, seen in Israel as prohibitive. But short of that, what can we be doing? I think for the time being, realistically, Israel should be focused on a few things. I alluded to one of them earlier when we were talking about Egypt. Whatever arrangement comes out of this latest back and forth, I think Israel is going to need to insist on a different mechanism of monitoring what goes into the Strip. The monitoring mechanisms that have gone through international institutions in the Gaza Strip, and there are several of them. I mean, there are a lot of, international NGOs, and the UN is there. Those mechanisms actually work quite well. And it's not from that Hamas has been able to, divert materials to use. No, actually, they work quite well. And what Israel should be doing is insisting on getting much more involvement, even to the point of boots on the ground, of international institutions and organizations. And here, maybe the Europeans, I don't know, I'm a little skeptical, but maybe we can we need to be enlisting many more international actors here. And in parallel, we need to make sure that if the Egyptians are really going to play a bigger role, that there is a clear understanding that we will not be permitting the kind of smuggling that was going on. There has to be a cost for some of this. And the other thing that I think we should be considering is, Israel, in contrast to 2014, I think Israel is in a different sort of strategic reality now, given these normalization agreements and given just sort of broader regional trends. And we really need to be thinking about how to make use of that new strategic reality. I mean, is there a way to enlist more involvement, more investment from our friends in Abu Dhabi now, and have them come in and, drive up the competition for Hamas, essentially. The big question there, though, is whether there's a willingness on the part of these Arab pragmatic states to really do that. And it's a question mark. I mean, they definitely have a strong interest, and it's an overlapping one with us, that we not see Hamas emboldened and rearmed and all the rest. So the interest is there. I think it's going to take more convincing to get the Emiratis and others involved in a way that both really keeps Hamas down and also in parallel tries to perhaps even reinvigorate what's left of the Palestinian Authority.
Interesting. I was thinking also while you were speaking, when you were talking about how the Sunni Arab states were they slowed things down a little bit in normalization, but there was no recalling of ambassadors or anything like that. To connect it to the previous question, it's interesting also that in the Israeli domestic politics, that Mansour Abbas, during the conflict, I think suspended talks and said, I won't go into talks while this conflict is going on with the Palestinians, etc. But once it was over, you never hear from him about it. And he went back to negotiations, and he's signed this agreement with Bennett and Lapid, and he would have signed an agreement with Netanyahu as well. And if that's what had been on offer, it's very interesting that he's very, just to go back to the previous question about Abbas, he's very singularly focused on his agenda of Arab citizens of Israel, I think, and is sort of really putting to one side in quite an unusual way, quite a surprising way, the Palestinian issue.
And I think it also speaks to, first of all, the fact that, I mean, his movement, in contrast to the northern branch of his movement.
Right.
But, his movement is we do need to be a little bit careful. I mean, yes, their roots were in the Brotherhood, but this is not really this is not the Muslim Brotherhood in the way that we sort of regionally. But the other thing that your point, I think, highlights is that, to go back to the question about whether Hamas won, it was highly disruptive. And for a brief moment, it looked like Hamas had even managed to torpedo the formation of a new government in Israel.
Yeah.
We're about to, if all, knock on wood that there's no violence, but that if a new government gets sworn in, whatever they think of that government, Hamas did not manage to do that.
Right. Very true. So there was another question here from Brad about the Palestinian Authority, and he was saying that given that Abbas is 85, and at some point there will be a change, it's interesting, he says, that a number of people that were going to run in the elections that were then cancelled by Abbas would have been very problematic for Israel. I don't know if you share that assessment, but that certainly there was no. It didn't seem like there was any likely success for Abbas that would be, the great sort of moderate, I don't know, Palestinian Anwar Sadat or King Hussein that Israel's been hoping for.
Yeah, so I don't think we were likely to get a King Hussein type. Also, of course, Hamas was going to participate in these elections.
Yeah, and we're going to do well.
Right. And they were likely going to win. So,
right.
So I'm not sure whether, well, anyway, that's, I guess, a separate issue. I think it was certainly in Abbas's interest not to see that happen. And I think it was likely in Israel's interest not to see these elections produce another Hamas government. But I don't think, this question of who will succeed Abbas and are they likely to be problematic for Israel? At this point, probably. If Abbas passed from the scene tomorrow, I don't think we would be in for the examples that were given of King Hussein or others that have been a bit more forward-leaning. Although, it's the Middle East, you never really know. Maybe we have an surprise, but I'm not sure that that's. I'm also not sure that that would be necessary for there to be some measure of progress when it comes to Israel and the PA. But I fully acknowledge, and I'm not sure if I don't want to put words in the mouth of the person who asked this, but there is a sort of implication. I think it's justified that there was a pretty clear policy in the last so many years of essentially keeping the PA pretty weakened, and above all, keeping the PA and Hamas, essentially keeping the West Bank and Gaza sort of separated politically. I think it was, in Israel, it was seen to be working in our interest to have the Palestinian movement generally sort of divided. And I think that now there's going to be a big reassessment of that policy, because I think in some circles there is a real recognition that, allowing for example, Qatari funding to come in and continue to support Hamas, because it's kind of the only address we have there, and we don't want to see a humanitarian disaster in Gaza. That's not morally, it's of course problematic, but also it's not in Israel's interest. I think there's going to be a reassessment of that policy, and alongside that, a look again at this claim that Israel has really not done enough to keep the Palestinian Authority in a strong enough position to be able to counter more extremist factions and potentially even to be able to enter into some kind of negotiations. But it's not an easy, I always sort of say when people start harping on Israel for having weakened the PA, I mean, there is some truth to that, definitely. And I think Israel bears some responsibility for the situation with the Palestinian Authority. But, the PA is not exactly, as the questioner alluded to. I mean, these guys are not King Hussein right now. And so it's not as if we are, it's not as if the choices are all that appealing.
Yeah. So let's have one final question. I want to make use of your expertise in the wider region to sort of bring that to bear on what might happen here in Israel in the next few months or years even. When the UAE signed the Abraham Accords, one of the claims that they made, which was sort of downplayed somewhat by Israel for, I think, for obvious political reasons, was that the UAE, that they had succeeded in pushing off the threat of Israel annexing Judea and Samaria, of annexing the West Bank. and that had been part of the agenda. And I'm not sure what the final agreement said, but certainly there was going to be some, there was not going to be any annexation for several years or something. We now have the prospect, at least, I don't want to say the certainty, certainly not in Israeli politics, but the prospect of a new government, which contains both a new prime minister who is himself an ardent annexationist, and also left-wing parties that are full-on two-state solution enthusiasts. Do you get a sense from anything that you've heard or read from the UAE and Bahrain and the Saudis and basically the Sunni states that are now signed on the dotted line allies or are de facto allies, that they intend to somehow get involved with this putative new Israeli government in pushing forward an Israeli-Palestinian re-engagement of a peace process? Or is that not on the agenda at all?
So I don't see much evidence yet of a real desire to do that. What I will say though is that, even before the latest round of violence with Hamas, you were starting to hear there were Emirati press accounts to this effect, and in conversations with private conversations with Emirati officials and folks close to the government there, you were starting to hear a frustration with indications of maybe some settlement expansion here, some little settlement building there. And now it coincided with a frustration and a kind of curiosity and a concern about what the Biden administration was going to do, if the Biden administration was going to follow through on the Trump administration's promises to the Emirates and others. But nonetheless, I pointed out why, because I think even if these states do not yet really show a desire to really get involved in brokering some kind of negotiation or bringing people back to the negotiating table, I do think that they are not going to shy away from, if they start to see, for example, moves on the part of the new Israeli government that, from their standpoint, go against the promise not to annex, at least in the near term. It's always a little bit unclear whether this was a kind of forever proposition or for now. But
right.
I think that they will not be shy about voicing that. And this is a really, I dare say, unique situation in Israeli history where we don't really know. I mean, we don't know what this government will do in terms of foreign policy. I mean, just that it's really difficult to tell. I mean, it's a very motley crew, as we know. And so it could be that everybody kind of cancels each other out. And so we're not much change.
Yeah.
But you could even imagine sort of, scenarios that maybe, sometimes this happens, that kind of left-wing parties are, because they know that they're on the left, they're even more eager to kind of show their bona fides. And so you end up getting kind of interesting policy decisions that you would not have expected from the left. And maybe the right is gonna be under more pressure from Washington. And so you find, but it's a really kind of strange situation where nobody really knows what this government, and that goes for obviously the people in these capitals of these states that, they're not naive. I mean, I think in places like the Emirates and elsewhere, I think that this was a strategic decision on their part. This was not just about annexation. This was not about the deal with Trump. This was a longer term decision, and it has more to do with how they want to see the region develop than it does about what this Israeli government or that Israeli government decides to do with the Palestinians.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Sarah Feuer, for joining us and enlightening us and lending us so much of your knowledge and wisdom about the region and recent events. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Anyone that is on this that is at this meeting that is not on my mailing list, you can email me. Excuse me, paulg@begincentre.org.il. I've just written it in the chat, and you can join my my mailing list for events in English, where you'll get all the details of these events in advance, and the Zoom info as well, so you don't even have to register. But I hope everyone will join us next week, when we'll be looking more at the Israeli political situation, either at the new government that has just been formed, or the failure of the government to form and the prospects of a fifth set of elections. But thank you, everyone, and thank you so much, Sarah, for it again. And good night or good day, everyone. See you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Paul. Bye-bye.